One, two, three. Thank you for being on the Gnostic Warrior today, Bernardo. How you doing?
Great. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to delve into the science of consciousness. This is one of my favorite subjects. I have several books on this. I've written about it. And when I came across your work, it really sparked a bunch of ideas that I had. And you talk about the science of ideas as well. And we're going to, get into that stuff as we get into the podcast. But if you could tell the people out there that don't know you a little bit about your path from being a scientist at CERN and then going into your new path now, where you're still a scientist, but you're going into some of those forbidden realms that a lot of scientists don't want to go into, and it deals with philosophy and theory as well. So please tell the audience about your path.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I started out at CERN. Actually, CERN was my first job. I worked in the Atlas experiment of the Large Hadron Collider back in the mid to late 90s. Following that, I went to corporate research. There were a number of reasons to do that. It paid better. It was more stable when I was a young guy. I had just married. And there I did a bunch of other things. I did processor technology, compiler technology, and I worked a lot on artificial intelligence throughout my life as well, either officially or unofficially in my own time. And when you're working with AI, you get exposed to these big questions. I mean, I'm designing a computer that is emulating intelligence. What would it take to make this computer conscious, not only to process data, but to feel what it is doing, for that data processing to be accompanied by experience? So I started asking these questions from a materialist perspective by default. I hadn't thought things through and become a materialist. I was a materialist just because, everybody around me was a materialist and seemed reasonable enough. But when you confront these questions about what it takes to create consciousness, and you start thinking about the difference between data processing and experience, well, at least in my case, after a short while, I realized that it was absurd, this notion that you could create consciousness out of arrangements of material, arrangements of unconscious matter, that there is nothing about mass, charge, momentum, spin, from which we could deduce the qualities of experience, what it is like to see red, what it is like to be disappointed, to have a bellyache. And then I took 10 steps back, and I started trying to figure out where things had gone wrong in that thought process, what assumptions were wrong. And I converged to this idea that consciousness being created out of material arrangements, that material arrangements were more primary, that assumption was wrong. Because all we have is consciousness anyway. So I thought consciousness must be primary, but then now I had to start figuring out how I could explain some patterns and regularities of nature from this basis, from consciousness being primary. Like, why does it seem like we all inhabit the same external world? Why can't I change the laws of nature just by imagining them to be different if it's all in consciousness? Or why is it that if you shoot myself in the head, something's going to happen in my consciousness? Or if I drink alcohol, and a more trivial example, my inner experience will also be affected. How do I make sense of all that? So that was the beginning of the journey that brought me to where I am today, 7 published books.
Yeah, and part of that process you mentioned, and sometimes I feel it comes down to simple ideas and simple theories, and you talk about knowing thyself. You actually don't say that. That's a big thing in Gnosticism, to know thyself. And in your scientific opinion, what is the self, and what does it take to truly know thyself? Because you explain that to be conscious, you have to be conscious of thyself, correct?
Well, I think a lot of, if not answers, at least the paths we need to explore start from introspection. Because if you start from what is on the screen of perception, you're making a lot of hidden assumptions about who is the observer, what is the process of observation. and focusing only on what is observed, while in fact there's an interplay of three factors here. And through introspection, you ask yourself, what is it that is observing? What is it that is experiencing? So you may translate that into know thyself. From a philosophical perspective, you can speak of two kinds of self. One self is what philosophers would call the dative of experience, the recipient of experience, which is pure subjectivity. It's a subjective point of view coupled to a field of experiences, but that field of experiences may be empty. All you're left with is that subjectivity, that I-ness, or a technical word would be ipseity, a sense of self. Now, this contentless recipient of experience is one kind of self. Another kind of self is determined by specific contents of experience. And you have certain memories, certain experiences right now. I have other memories. I have had another life history. I have different experiences. I see a different room around me right now. So you could say that Bernardo as a self is determined by that personal history, that set of experiences that identifies me as one specific being and you as another. But the pure self, the dative of experience, that is indistinguishable between people. The pure subjectivity behind me and behind you are exactly the same because it is not differentiated by specific memories or specific experiences.
And this self, in studying mental illness, and I've studied crime, and I see people sometimes have multiple selves that seem to go from almost a Dr. Jekyll to a Mr. Hyde. So in kind of playing devil's advocate with your explanation there, is there other forms of consciousness that can take over the human biology, this apparatus here, and take over my mind? So this self is actually maybe something else controlling me, possibly, the gut biome, they say, is your second mind. And I'm finding that a lot of people that have issues seem to have problems with their gut, and a lot of the things that they're taking into their bodies, the materials per se, are increasing these organisms in their body. And so I wanted you to kind of touch on that. Are there different forms of consciousness, in your opinion, meaning human and then maybe non-human, that are operating in us people, whatever we are?
Well, you alluded to Jekyll and Hyde, and the archetypical example of dissociative identity disorder. It is a scientific fact that dissociative identity disorder happens. We have, after decades of doubt, we have proven this through neuroimaging now. There is something dissociative processes look like when you put it under a brain scanner or an EEG. So people's minds can fragment itself into different disjoint centers of consciousness, different personalities. The old name of dissociative identity disorder is multiple personality disorder. So you can have multiple content-driven selves, different selves that have different life histories, self-images, memories, and they may not even be friendly with one another. So this is in the literature, it can happen. Is there non-human consciousness? Surely there is animal consciousness, there is plant consciousness, there is a microscopic consciousness, and we are inhabited by lots of microscopic beings. I mean, you alluded to the gut biome. There are countless organisms in there. Could they take us over? I don't think so. Why would that be the case? But could we dissociate into split personalities that have different characters, different agendas? Oh, you bet, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I've researched into the split brain phenomenon where they cut the corpus callosum, and that seems to change people as well. Have you researched any of that, Bernardo? I don't want to get into anything maybe that's out of that realm.
Yeah, there was the common wisdom until a couple of years ago was that a person with a severed corpus callosum would have two disjoint centers of consciousness, effectively be two people in one. But there has been more recent research that seems to cast doubt on that. Obviously, something changes, but it may not necessarily be that degree of dissociation. It may have to do with, because I mean, we tend to conflate the term consciousness. Sometimes we mean two different things by the term. One is consciousness in the sense of there being experience, pure experience, and consciousness in the sense of there being metacognitive experience. In other words, that you don't only experience, but you know that you experience, that you can objectify and study and characterize your own mental contents. That is meta-consciousness. Maybe severing the corpus callosum has an effect on what we are able to access introspectively at this metacognitive level, at this meta-conscious level, but not necessarily a dissociative split of consciousness. I don't know exactly where the consensus is today. I haven't followed that very closely.
Sure. Yeah, I think that no one's reached a consensus. It's just the research is out there. And then you have the theory as far as materialism and spiritualism and the different left and right brain functions. Do you feel that plays a part in materialism and people being more materialistic, for example, being more left brain leaning, as opposed to being more religious on the right brain? Where you seem to kind of be in the middle in the corpus callosum area, where you're kind of mediating between the two. Do you feel that plays a part in it? Where
surely, yeah. I mean, what we call left brain. I mean, there isn't this strict division in the brain, but okay, let's not get to that. I know what you mean. Left brain people would be more analytical. It would be about taking things apart, zooming in, linear thinking, sequential logic. And right brain people would be more holistic, more taking things at a glance and experiencing and the emotional part of it as well, having insights as opposed to deriving conclusions from linear analysis. And surely this play a role. I mean, Western culture for the past 200 years easily has been highly dominated by this so-called left brain analytical mode of consciousness, in which we try to dissect everything, in which we elevate rationality to the position of most important and sometimes even the only valid psychic function of a human being, which is absurd. It's like cutting off one's limbs. I mean, why will you cut off all the other psychic functions that are available to us, including intuition, emotional intelligence, and so on, insight, non-linear insight? But our culture has been dominated by that particular psychic function for the last 200 years. Even our educational system favors that above everything else. There are valiant attempts to correct this through art and other things. But if you look, for instance, at universities worldwide, not only in the Western world, but in Japan as well, they are driven by economic factors mostly. So, for instance, the humanities, there's a serious debate to kill off the humanities because you're not training people to be economically productive, to help your country be competitive in the world market. So we are turning people into very logical thinking tools in order to optimize our economic potential. But we are forgetting to help people figure out what they are alive for. I mean, we are working very hard to stay alive longer, to have more things, to have more economic power, but we are forgetting to ask, what are we alive for? And that's more the right-brained part. That's more the humanities part. What are we here for? To not spend any attention on that. It's like spending all of your money and time to optimize your car and then forgetting to go for a ride.
And enjoy it while you're here, right?
Yeah.
With the roof down and the sun shining on you. So what on your path, Bernardo, had caused you to look at life and science from the right brain and to really put philosophy and some spirituality into it. Did you have any type of religious upbringing or spiritual upbringing, or was this something that you had come to in your path as an older gentleman?
If anything, I think my upbringing was mostly scientific and left-brain oriented. My mother is a Catholic, practicing Catholic, so I was exposed to some of that, but not in the sense that I was pushed in that direction. My mother was happy to be a Catholic herself, but I was not sent to Sunday school or anything like that. I never really thought about why I explore these things. I mean, even in philosophy today, you mentioned philosophy as if it were an example of the right-brained, holistic part of the deal. Today, there is something we call analytic philosophy. That's where I am, actually. My work is mostly analytic philosophy, at least recently taking a second PhD now in analytic philosophy. And that kind of philosophy is very, very left-brain oriented. It's extremely left-brain oriented.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm seeing that in basically all the fields of academia where you are studying these philosophical subjects or spiritual even, and it's always from you're taken out of the equation. You know, it's just basically this is the data on the left and the right or what's going on, and there's no philosophical theories being put to it. I wouldn't say that with your work because it seems like you're doing both with that, you know, and you're actually getting published in as far as what kind of journals are those called? As far as
academic journals.
Okay, academic journals. Okay, and go ahead.
No, you could please finish your question.
No, I was pretty much done. I was done.
Okay. Philosophy. I will be oversimplistic here, but I think it will help. There are two main streams of philosophy. There is what they call Continental philosophy, which is the philosophy of the Germans, the French, and there is Analytic philosophy, which was created in the beginning of the 20th century in England, and it's the philosophy that dominates England, the US. Actually, it's the philosophy that dominates most academic philosophy in the world today. Now, the Continental guys were more inclined to right brain type of things, more holistic. Emotions played a role. It's about the absurdity of existence, how do we do about it, how to live a good life, and so on. And the analytic philosophy guys, they are like mathematicians or linguists of a philosophical ideas. They almost think in terms of axioms, theorems, derivations, and all that. How do you prove things? That's where I am, actually. Officially speaking, that's where I publish my philosophy work. And our culture today has such an emphasis on, quote, left brain modes of thinking that even philosophy has been taken over by that mode of thinking. And my own view is, look, I can do two things. I can rebel against it, and then I will have no impact in the system. Or I can acquiesce to it and fight the good fight according to the rules of the game that are given to me and try to make an impact that way. So I decided for the latter. I decided that, okay, I will fight this on analytic terms, clear, sequential logic in which you have to base your case on sound internal consistency, empirical adequacy. What you're saying should explain what we actually observe, and parsimony. To be simplistic about it, we try to find the simplest explanations possible for what is in front of us. And it turns out that even if you acquiesce, even if you sort of surrender to this analytic mode of thinking, you can go a long way. Materialism, even from an analytic perspective, is a very troubled philosophy, very difficult to defend.
Sure, but in the same breath, it's nice that it's being explored. So I like that you're able to do that and put some of your personal preferences to the side to kind of conform. And I realized that actually not too long ago. I've always been a rebel and always kind of fighting and sometimes, taking things personal as opposed to joining the game and playing by the rules of the game, and then also throwing your ideas out there and being respectful to everybody, no matter the difference of our opinions. And, we're seeing actually the opposite of that now on the internet. It seems like in different crowds. I don't know. Are you seeing any backlash against you for, going from CERN to your path now?
No, but I set up my life in a way that sort of became more or less immune. I earned my living doing corporate strategy. And the corporate world doesn't care much what my philosophical positions are, so long as I help them make money and have good business, which, thank goodness, I have been able to do for the past 20 years. So I'm not fighting for tenure. I don't have a boss as far as my philosophical and scientific ideas are concerned. So I can just say what I actually think, and I have nothing to lose. The backlash is, if any, is the mouthpieces of materialism, people who make a living trying to make fun of anybody who is not a materialist. They have come after me, but it has not lasted very long. I mean, these guys are used to more or less soft targets, and I say that not in a pejorative way, but I'm using the words they would use. People who come from a more religious background, they consider soft targets because you know why? The reigning worldview determines not only the worldview, but the value system according to which you judge the adequacy of a worldview. Materialism has hijacked our value system. So a worldview is judged on the basis of parsimony, internal logical consistency, and all that, which is what is supposed to favor materialism. So people who come from a different value system, they perceive these mouthpieces of materialism. They perceive that they can wash the floor with these guys, religious leaders, and so on, and they are used to that. They think it is easy, and with me it's different because I don't come from that perspective at all. I'm coming in basing my argument on exactly the same value system they have, and it becomes then tough to argue with me. I would love to have longer debates with the mouthpieces of materialism. Still looking for an opportunity to do that. I have had some, but unfortunately, they have disengaged quite quickly.
Yeah, and that brings me up. You had written an article. Let me put my glasses on here, a recent one, Why Dismissing Philosophy Threatens the Integrity of Science. And I think you had written that specifically to address those people. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. But you had said that it has become sadly common for science popularizers to dismiss philosophy as an empty, altogether useless discipline consisting of circular abstractions. Even scientist Stephen Hawking went as far as to declare philosophy dead. I believe that the public dismissal of philosophy rather than reaffirm science brings harm to its integrity. You kind of explained it there, but can you... Richard Dawkins would be one of those people that is constantly attacking, religion and so forth. Can you explain a little bit?
Neil deGrasse Tyson also attacked philosophy in a sort of more or less funny way. You see, science is about the behavior of nature. It's about what nature will do given certain initial conditions and what we know about the laws of nature. It's all about behavior. It's not about essence. It's not about isness. Science tells nothing about what nature is. It only tells us about how nature behaves, whatever it is. To give you an example, you can, 5-year-old kids play computer games very well. They know how the game behaves. They know so well they can win and become champions. But they don't know what the game is. They have no idea about the underlying computer hardware, the processors, the memories, the interfaces, the software that runs on that. They have no idea about what the game is. They only know how it behaves, and they know enough to win. Science is about how this game of life behaves, and we use that to build technology. In other words, to play the game in a way that is advantageous to us. That's the game of science and technology, but they have nothing to say about what nature is fundamentally, because that's the method. The method is a method of experimentation. We do certain things and we see how nature responds. What is this response of nature? It's the behavior of nature. Science explains one thing in terms of another. They never tell you what things essentially are. And that's how it should be. That's the value of the methodology of science, which is extraordinarily important, and far from me to put it down. But when scientists lose sight of the fact that they are only looking at behavior and that they are not qualified by their education, by their mode of thinking, or by the tools they have given the methodology of science to make any statement about what science, what the world is, they end up with absurd conclusions. They take a certain philosophical position, materialism. Materialism is a metaphysics. It's an idea or a position about what the world is. They take that for granted in an unexamined way. And that's just stupid thinking. Let me use the word. That's plain stupidity, and it even more so when they do not know that it is stupidity. It's even more worrying, because then it's blind stupidity. And it demeans science, because we're trying to make science do something that it can't do. And that, I think, is a disservice to science.
And that must explain why you went into analytical philosophy, which it's a combination of the both, correct?
Well, analytical philosophy is sort of left-brain philosophy.
Just real simple, right?
Yeah.
I got to study that a little bit more. I'm more in the right brain world, but I do a lot of left brain stuff as well. But I wanted to talk about the world of ideas. And in Plato's philosophy, he calls the more real world the world of eidos, idea in English, which, in a more Gnostic sense, the matrix or the material reality constructed by man through forms or ideas. This is the Platonic idea. Plato makes eidos. I say this word because this is the Greek, one of the main philosophical concepts, and is the main premise behind the theory of forms or theory of ideas, which represent the most accurate reality. Okay, so what's interesting is if I'm big into etymology, studying words and where they come from. So if you study the Greek word, where it comes from the word to know, to see. Basically, it's a form of gnosis, epigenosis. The words have the same semantic range and general meaning as the Greek words eido. So to know is to observe or to come to know through observation, to perceive and understand. And so this knowledge is really experiential knowledge. It's experiencing it. And we moved away from that, from experiencing it just to explaining it from almost like a third point of view.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Okay. Sorry if I didn't make sense there.
No, I think this is fertile ground. I mean, the mystical traditions from the East, Advaita Vedanta, these very old traditions that have been encoded in the Upanishads, these are introspective currents in the sense that you achieve gnosis or you achieve insight through introspection, not through observing the world. And Plato added something extraordinary to this, which was to say, look, behind everything you see around you, there are the ideal forms, those basic templates. And everything you see is actually a distorted copy of one of those ideal forms, one of those basic templates. So what he did right there was to say that we can also achieve gnosis by looking around, not only by introspecting, but by observing the world, trying to distill from the material on the screen of perception, that ideal form that what you see is trying to imitate, or that what you see is a distorted copy of, a representation of. And those ideal forms would then inform you, would then tell you something more profound about how the world is put together, because they would be the being of the world, not only the patterns of behavior of the world, but the being of the world, the archetypal thoughts that underlie all reality. And that was an extraordinary move that we still, I think, don't take seriously enough.
Yeah, I agree. And if we look into the scripture, I'm going to get a little religious with you here, Bernardo. And you're bringing up actually a lot of where I want to go to here. So what we can call true spiritual knowledge or gnosis, this was the message that I believe was of Jesus in the New Testament, showing the path, meaning that Jesus was a person, an idea, a person who lived a specific way that became someone that we could, mold ourselves after. And that's why he was lifted up in, the Abrahamic religions as far as Christianity goes, the Orthodox and Roman religion. Like when Jesus rebuked the Pharisees in John 8:55 by differentiating his knowledge of the Father with theirs by claiming that his is on the order of idea. So in John 5:37, Jesus shows that his knowledge of the Father is different from the Pharisees when he says, "You have never heard his voice or seen his form." In other words, they don't really have true spiritual knowledge or gnosis of the Father because they lacked love. Jesus had true gnosis, and this is why it is called idomen in the scripture. Okay, so I don't know why I put this all in here. Let me get to the point here, sorry. Okay, so here's where I'm getting to, Bernardo, and folks that are listening. It is well known by Christians that Jesus was not only a wandering teacher, he was a master and their Messiah who imparted knowledge, gnosis, on how to live to his followers. The facts are that in order to acquire knowledge and teach it, you must first formulate ideas. Then they become a vision, which leads to a plan, designs, proposals, or a proposition to the people. And this definition of the ideas is the basis of a teacher's main job, describing exactly what Jesus does to his followers. So he comes from the tribe of Ida, the tribe of Judah. And I know I'm getting a little out there, but in the philosophy of Platonic thought, the life of Jesus is really an idea, which is an eternally existing pattern of which individual things in any class, religion, are imperfect copies. So most Christians follow Jesus' ideas of how to live, but many sin, a word that means to miss the mark. They get the idea, but they don't have the gnosis or true salvation. Therefore, they are imperfect copies of Jesus. So where I'm getting at there is that can people be a Platonic idea or a form that we can then mold ourselves after? And we see that in celebrities and so forth today.
Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosopher, he said precisely that. He said that every species on this planet, every living species, like people, Homo sapiens, dogs, cats, the whole thing, are the manifestation of ideal forms, Platonic ideal forms, that manifest themselves in an imperfect, distorted way, as you, me, my cats, and so forth. So yes, living beings are molded after certain templates, according to Schopenhauer. I follow Schopenhauer in this. I give it sort of analytical twist. My twist to this is to say, okay, there is only universal consciousness. Experiences are patterns of excitation of consciousness. And of course, if they are patterns of excitation, and then there are certain preferred modes, normal modes of excitation, in the same way that if you pluck a guitar string, it would tend to vibrate on a certain note and not in others, depending on how long it is, depending on the elasticity of the guitar string. It will have a certain normal mode. And I would say universal consciousness has certain normal modes. And these normal modes, the preferential frequencies or patterns in which universal consciousness tends to vibrate or to be excited, corresponds to Plato's ideal forms. And we are the extrinsic appearance, the image of these notes of universal consciousness being played. Distorted appearances, but nonetheless a distorted representation of what's going on.
What's interesting when you bring up that guitar string and the notes, it made me think about how people that have similar ideas seem to play on the same chord, meaning, me reaching out to you, people that I like to have on the podcast, things I like to read, ideas that I see out there that I incorporate into my life that are beneficial and that will make me a better person, that I take from other people that have similar ideas as me, because people that don't, I tend to not want to associate with. Like, I'm on a different level as far as, and that gets me to my next question, which is, are there different levels of consciousness that we could vibrate at and repel from in the energy sense?
I think empirically that seems to be the case, and I think we all can relate to the experience that you just told. We are attracted to certain things and repulsed by other things. The danger of it, though, if we surrender to this completely, is that the world will end up being divided amongst different tribes, and these tribes will not communicate and they will not make progress. They will just be, gazing at their own bellies and not advancing. They will feel reassured because there will be a collective around them that will reassure them that what they think is right, the way they behave is right. And all the other guys who are saying that, well, there's more to it. Oh, they're just idiots. They are from that other tribe. And I think social media favors this kind of clustering of the zeitgeist into these different tribes that can't really communicate. In the ideal world, we would find a common language, and then we would have the patience and openness to really try to see past the words of the other side, but discern the meaning as well, because words are carriers of meaning, but they are very imperfect. What you see happening today in the culture is that people seize on the words, and if they find inaccuracy in the words, they'll say, you see, you are full of it, and I don't need to listen to you. But that becomes then just a syntactical game, a semantic game even. People no longer try to really see past the words into the intended meaning, and that's where things go wrong, I think.
Yeah, and I believe that comes to, the problem where our society, as you had mentioned, our culture for the last 200 years has been more left brain. There's no philosophy in those opinions or those judgments by those people. I find it important not to always judge by what a person says, but maybe, take a step back and, why did they say that? And who is this person? And they're on a different path than I am. And they have different ideas and different things. But in the end, we're all striving to have a better life and so forth. But yeah, the division online, I see it's becoming more transparent, what's going on. But what I see is a lot of emotions involved in it. And when I see people acting reasonable and rational, they tend to put the emotions on the back burner and remain calm. So it seems like the emotions seem to override reason. Can you explain that, the science of that, if you care to delve into that?
I'm not a neuroscientist, and I have a couple of very high degrees, but neuroscience is not one of them. Although I have studied recent neuroscience of consciousness quite in some depth. But you see, you don't need to be a neuroscientist to know that human beings are driven by emotion. That's the point. I mean, we have to acknowledge that. And people who don't think they are emotional, well, those are the ones who need the psychologist most. They need to run, not walk, to the nearest analyst and have a look at what they are hiding in that closet, all the skeletons in the closet. We are driven by emotion. Rationality is a tool that has evolved late in our history as a species. Pretty late, in fact. The thing is, why does rationality seem so overwhelming today? It's because the value system of our culture has been overwhelmed. I could say hijacked, but that suggests that there has been malicious intent, and I don't want to, that's not what I want to say, but one way or the other, our value system is a left-brained, to use your terminology, a left-brained value system. That's the basis on which we judge what people are saying. So we reward people who hide their emotions and come across as very reasonable and rational. And that's all very fine, so long as it doesn't come at the cost of our emotional lives, because ultimately there's only one thing that is transformative, and that's to feel a certain truth, to experience it directly, to be experientially and emotionally acquainted with it, in touch with it, as opposed to becoming merely convinced at a conceptual level that something is true. I fight a conceptual battle because culture depends on language, and language favors this left-brained approach. Language is linear. Subject, verb, object. There are certain syntactical rules that follow certain logic. And because of language being the basis of communication, in other words, the basis of culture, then the entire value system of our culture has become conceptual, so to say. So I fight that conceptual battle, but I'm keenly aware that if somebody takes one of my books, reads it, and becomes conceptually convinced that what I'm saying is right, that is not going to be transformative. It is not going to change one's life, because one's inner life is mostly emotional. It's about whether you're feeling happy or depressed. These are emotions. My hope is that by convincing people at a conceptual, logical level, very left-brain oriented, that they will give themselves permission to open up to the experience. Because the intellect is the bouncer of the heart. I repeat this a lot. I like to say this a lot. At least for me, my intellect has been the bouncer of my heart my whole life. If I am intellectually convinced that something cannot be true, I will never open up to the experience entailed by that thing. So my hope is that acknowledging that that's the value system of our culture, it is what it is because we depend on language to create a culture, that I will help people give themselves permission to have a truly transformative experience, a direct acquaintance with the mental universe, the fact that everything is consciousness and that we are all connected.
Are these emotions connected to consciousness, or do you believe that they're separate and more tied to the body, even though the consciousness needs the body to operate?
I think the body is the image of a process in consciousness. I don't see the body as separate from consciousness. I think there is a certain level of metaphor, a certain level of abstraction in which dualism is a valid metaphor and it makes things easier to understand and to grasp. But ultimately, I think it's all consciousness. My body is the image of my conscious processes as observed from your point of view. As observed from my point of view, it's just my conscious inner life, including the segments that we call, quote, unconscious. In other words, the experiences that I cannot introspectively access. I am experiencing them, but I do not know that I am experiencing them. All that presents itself to you as my body. I think at the end of the day, there is only consciousness, and emotions are probably one of the highest notes of excitation of consciousness, much higher than a purely conceptual insight, which is cool and analytical, and it doesn't really move things. Emotions move people to build worlds or destroy worlds.
Which they could be good and bad, right?
Yeah.
So we hear a lot about the ego out there, and especially in the spiritual realm and in Gnosticism as well. You hear about the ego. Is the consciousness separate from the ego? Because you hear the ego being bad, and that's always tied to emotions. Hey, suppress the ego, suppress your emotions. What are your thoughts on that?
There are several different definitions of ego. There is the Freudian definition of ego. There's the Jungian definition of ego. They were the classical definitions of ego in the early 20th century. I think what people tend to call the ego, and I'm more in the analytical line, the Jungian line on this, the ego is the center of the contents of consciousness that we can introspectively access. The stuff that we experience, and we know that we experience both. The center of those contents, introspectively accessible, is what we call the ego. Ultimately, the ego is a story that consciousness tells itself. It's the story of the me. It's the story of who I am, where I was born, that I'm a poor guy, or maybe I'm an arrogant guy, whatever. It's the story you tell yourself about what you are. That's the ego. That's what defines the boundaries of the ego. And the self, in Jungian terminology, goes much beyond the ego. The self encompasses all the experiences that Jungians call unconscious, which basically means conscious experiences that we cannot introspectively access at will. That would be the self, the center of everything, as opposed to the center of what you can introspectively access. And I think, from an analytic philosophy perspective, as I just mentioned, the ego is just a story you tell yourself based on certain contents of consciousness. And the true self is the dative of experience, the recipient of experience, that to which experience is given or disclosed from a perspective. And it is contentless. It's the same in you, in me, in my fish, in my cats, in the amoeba on my toilet, for all I know. It is pure subjectivity. That's identical in everybody, because if you remove the contents, then there is no story it can tell itself about what it is. It's just what Schopenhauer called the eternal eyes of the world, which looks out from every creature. That's the way he described it. People have described it in different ways throughout the millennia, but this knowledge has been with humanity for a long time.
I love that explanation of the ego, and it's provable, because you could, program yourself to think differently, in days and a week, and to change the way you look at the world and change how you think about yourself by simply changing your thoughts, and you could reform your ego. You could change your path, like you had went from a CERN scientist and you started thinking about your path and what you were doing, and then you went into analytical philosophy. So your ego, you started talking to yourself, and you kind of changed the contents into your path now.
Yeah.
And if you didn't change it, your ego might have had overridden your program, where you didn't make that change in your path. I don't know if that makes sense, but
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm not a scientist, but I love your explanations there. Okay. So you talk about other organisms having consciousness. So animals, organisms do have consciousness?
I surely think so. Yeah, I think there's plenty of reasons to believe that. You see, I think ultimately there is only one universal consciousness. There is only one subject, so to say. You may call it any name you want. I don't think I need to give examples. People understand immediately what I mean by that, I think, hopefully. Different living creatures, I think, are just dissociated complexes of universal consciousness, dissociated personalities, if you will. Like a psychiatric patient with dissociative identity disorder has these multiple disjoint centers of consciousness, these multiple disjoint personalities that can be in control of the body at different moments in time. I think universal consciousness has multiple disjoint alters, multiple disjoint personalities. And I think living bodies, biology, is the image of those disjoint complexes of universal consciousness. I am one, you are another, the amoeba is another, my cat is another. And why do I then say that the animals also have private inner life, private dissociated inner life? In other words, conscious inner life that cannot access the consciousness of the rest of the universe. I say that because there is one very important thing that unifies all life into a very clearly discernible category, and that is metabolism. All living organisms metabolize. And at the microscopic level, metabolism is the same across all life. So in my view, metabolism is what dissociation at a universal scale looks like from our perspective. What we call it is life. Life is the image of that dissociation. So I surely think that each one of the fishes in my aquarium downstairs also have an I, also have a subjective point of view, experiencing the world around it. Yeah.
Synchronism right there. I was actually right. My next question or my next statement was my fish. We have a fish in the bathroom, and he's in our bathroom, our fish tank. And every time we go to the bathroom, we get to spend some time with our fish, and doing it for so long, spending so much time with my fish in the bathroom, and seeing him sleep and then wake up and then look at us, and seems like he's smiling. Some days he's mad. It seems like he does have, or she does have consciousness, the fish, and they're experiencing this, just like when I put him into a small little bowl to change it, his aquarium, the water and so forth, he's very unhappy, fluffs up and gets all upset. And then when I put him back in there, he's swimming around and happy. And then he's literally looking at me all the time, and I feel like we're sharing this experience together. And what's interesting is at first I really didn't have feelings for the fish, and now I have feelings for the fish. I care if he's happy and if he's sad, and how's it doing? Hey, did you guys feed the fish? And this is just a little $2 fish that my kids had won, and I feel like we're sharing this experience together, and I want it to be happy, just like I want my children to be happy, and so forth. So it's interesting you bring that up. And what interests me as well is also the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of side of society. And I've seen this because I've also seen it myself, Bernardo. And I know not everybody has these experiences, but I believe that there's a form of consciousness that certain people seem to fragment into that seems almost parasitical. And where I'm going with this ties into the microbiome thing that I talked about earlier. So if we talk about materiality and, us humans consuming different things, you had mentioned alcohol, that affects our consciousness. And if we look at what alcohol is, it's essentially a fermented beverage, whether it be fermented grapes, we're drinking wine, or if it's beer, it's fermented barley, which is essentially made by a parasitic organism. And what I've realized, my parents were alcoholics. I was an alcoholic. I've recently stopped drinking, and I noticed a big difference in my behavior as far as being able to control that bad side of me, that I feel, that the anger that comes out, the side that I don't like, that nobody likes. And I've seen this come out in other people, whether they commit crimes or they do things when they drink that they would never, ever do when they were sober or conscious or themselves. So my theory here is that, if an ant could be taken over by a fungus, why can't humans also be taken over? And if it's clear that they're drinking a parasite in this substance and they're acting in this evil behavior, or they're taking in a lot of food that might be fungus covered and they start changing their behavior, can it be that these people are now being taken over by another organism, if it is a conscious organism, causing them to overeat, causing them to keep drinking and killing themselves, so this organism can then eat them because that's what they do?
You framed it in a very scientific way. You mentioned the example of parasites who take over the brains of ants and sort of radio control the ants, make them do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Yes, that exists. We know that has been studied. And then you're saying, could that happen with us? Could we ingest a physical living organism that's parasitic and that could go to our brain and fool around with the way we think? This is something that you can put to the test. There are brain parasites, we know. So what you're saying can happen, but these are known diseases, have been cataloged. Could there be more that we have not cataloged yet? Surely there could be. It was only last year that we discovered the second largest organ in the human organism, a discovery done by a friend of mine, Neil Tyson, which is a tissue, a kind of tissue that surrounds all of our organ systems. Had never been seen before. It was only a couple of years ago that we've discovered that our lymphatic system goes up into the brain, and that there are lymph vesicles or lymph channels in the brain. We didn't know that until a couple of years ago. How could that be, right? I mean, we had mapped the entire human organism, and we should know what's in there and what is not. And we keep on discovering these things that are not even subtle. They're very large. They're very obvious. So, yeah, it could be. But I sense that you're coming at it from a more spiritual perspective. Could there be a conscious organism that is not in this material plane and which is parasitic to us? What I would put forward as an alternative way of thinking, not an alternative, but a possible way of thinking to be considered and to be contemplated is the following. Where do you draw the boundary about what is in yourself and what is other? If ultimately it's all one universal consciousness, then at that level, it's all us. Right? It's all us. We are playing with ourselves. There is only one subject going on here. And whatever horrible things happen, it is that consciousness doing it to itself. But of course, at a practical level, you are a human being, I am another. And I don't want people to come here to my house and throw a bomb through my window. I certainly don't want that. And I will defend myself from that. So there are these pragmatic considerations. But then when you look at what Jungians call the human unconscious, which I would call the obfuscated part of consciousness, they discovered that there's a lot there. There's much more in there than the ego. And I'll be very honest with you. I have what Jungians call a shadow. I have a shadow. There's a shadow side in me, and that comes out in traffic. When I'm driving, comes out big time. Scares me, scares my girlfriend when it comes out. There's another Bernardo, it's another creature, another something that happens there. But I see that as me. It's a mode of my own thinking that manifests under certain circumstances. I'm not a moralist in the sense that I don't think there is a absolute ethics, an absolutely correct and an absolutely incorrect way of behaving. I think all behaviors of human beings are part of nature. This is an empirical observation. The most cruel psychopath you've ever seen, he too or she is a part of nature. It's a potential of universal consciousness manifesting itself through that person. I don't see anything inherently or absolutely negative or positive about it, although I will defend myself and my loved ones against that manifestation of universal consciousness to the best of my forces. It's only pragmatically that we take actions about it in society, so to optimize our ability to make progress as a society. But I see that as pragmatic, not as absolute.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It made me think of the ego possibly playing a part in this type of behavior, meaning the stories that are told and filled into that ego, and maybe when these people become unconscious or they drink or they take a drug, that ego is in control without any reason anymore. Maybe there's something being turned off there, and that ego, that kind of master animal kind of takes control, and we all have that kind of, as you had mentioned, that shadow part. And I see that in everybody. It all seems like a fraction of it. Like it's, hey, traffic kind of brings out that dark side of Bernardo, but otherwise you've got it pretty much under control, and there's not much that's going to kind of break that, and some people, traffic doesn't do it. They could handle that. Me, yeah, traffic does do it, but I actually control myself better in traffic. It's when people get angry with me or come at me sideways. I came from the street, so it's always been, hey, I got to fight, or else they're going to rob me, and take my stuff. So I still have that kind of ego inside of me.
An analyst, a Jungian analyst, which I'm not, would say the following. The more you resist it, the more you try to push it away, the more energy it gets. But if you recognize it as part of yourself and be kind to it, then you can integrate it. And then it's under control, but under control in a different way. It's a kind sort of control, as opposed to a repressive sort of control, if you know what I mean. I try to be kind to my shadow. It's pretty difficult sometimes. I give myself permission to manifest my shadow when I know that it's not going to hurt anybody. Like if there is a dust bag around and there is nobody watching, then I would do certain things that I would not normally do. Or if I break something, I'm not going to recriminate myself afterwards. Oh, how stupid you were. You couldn't control yourself. You broke your iPad or whatever because you're angry. I'll try to be kind to myself and say, you know what? That's where I was at that moment. I was angry. I broke the darn iPad. It's just an object. Fine. I'm not going to recriminate myself because of it. That's how I try to go about it. I'm not saying that you should do the same. Far from me. But the Jungian perspective would be this. Instead of turning it into an alien that you repress and say, this is other, it's not me, the Jungian perspective would be, no, make it yours. Make it yours, welcome it, be kind to it, because then, only then, it's truly under control.
Yeah, and that's there's a well-known philosopher right now making his rounds, Jordan Peterson, and he also takes that role as well, and that is interesting. Let me get on here to... Okay. What else would you like to talk about today? Let's talk a little bit about your time at CERN and what is the purpose. You know, there's a lot of conspiracy theories going out there. I sometimes have people on my program that delve into some of those subjects. I try to take the middle road, but I would like you, being a former CERN scientist, to kind of explain the nature of CERN, what you did there, and why you decided to leave.
From my personal experience, having been there mid to late 90s, I see no evidence to entertain any conspiracy theory about CERN whatsoever. CERN is an international organization. It's hosted in Switzerland and France. The site goes across the border. Most of it is in France, but the main offices are in Switzerland. People come from all over the world, from different universities. They come to CERN to help build an experiment, to run the experiment. They collect data, and often they go back home to analyze the data and publish papers. CERN has a small core staff. Most people at CERN are what we call users. They are professors or students from different universities in different countries, and they go there for a time. They do some work. They go back home with data, and then they analyze the data. And there's a core staff of people who are there all the time, and they work for CERN. What they try to do there is to refine the best model we have to date about how matter behaves at a microscopic level. The tiniest level that we can see, how does matter behave. And to see that, we need enormous amounts of energy. If you collide particles at very, very, very high energy, the detritus of those collisions will be kinds of particles that only existed for a fraction of a second after the Big Bang. And they have decayed, so you don't see them anymore in the universe. You can only see them if you smash current matter, very high energies, and then you release those primordial particles that were there in the beginning for a very tiny fraction of a second. And it turns out that if you can release them and measure them, actually, we don't actually measure them, we measure their decaying components. They exist for too tiny a fraction of a second for us to measure them. So they decay, and then we measure the result of that decay, and then we can reconstruct what happened. And this gives people high confidence that our models of the behavior of nature at the tiniest microscopic level are correct. One of the missing particles was the famous Higgs boson. which is the particle associated with the Higgs field, which is what explains why things have inertia. Why it's difficult to stop a train when it's already moving, or why it's difficult to make the train move when it's not moving to begin with. That inertia, it's some kind of, there is a sticky field in the universe that resists changes in speed. That's what we call inertia. And that field is the Higgs field. It has a corresponding particle, the Higgs boson, that was predicted 50 years ago or more. And we needed to find out whether that prediction was correct. It would make us feel very happy. And then we invested billions and billions of euros to find the darn particle. And ultimately, we did find it. So it only tells us about how nature behaves at those tiny scales. It tells us very little or nothing about very little about what nature is in and of itself.
It's interesting. It made me think about human procrastination and that feeling I get, that just like where I want to do something, and I'm doing a lot of research and I've got to get some certain things done, but I'm kind of stuck and I'm procrastinating, and I'm thinking but I'm not moving, and I just feel like, I just need to take a shower. I need to go do something. And then when I go do it and I'm moving and I kind of put these ideas to action, it's just like, I feel alive, that's what it made me think about.
We talk about the physical universe, inertia, the Higgs field. These are all images, right? This is how the universe as it is in itself presents itself to us on the screen of perception. What it is in itself, we have no idea. Kant already explained that at the end of the 18th century, that all we have access to is the way things present themselves to us, the way they appear. We have no access to what they are in themselves. So if inertia is a regularity of how matter appears to us, you might ask yourself, well, what is the corresponding thing in itself of inertia? What does inertia correspond to as the thing in itself? I would say that the thing in itself is emotions, thoughts that underlie the physical world out there, even the inanimate universe. They appear to us as matter, inertia, and all these properties that we study. So maybe procrastination is the thing in itself of inertia, for all I know. I don't know. Maybe love is the thing in itself behind light. I don't know.
Yeah, and then you mentioned decay, and that makes me think of fungi, right? So if I'm sitting here long enough and I don't move, eventually something's going to decay me and eat me, right? The organisms that are all around me, the mushrooms are going to start growing out of my hands on the computer.
Second law of thermodynamics, everything tends to more disorder. We resist it as organisms, and it's one of the miracles of nature that we locally resist the second law of thermodynamics. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And I always kind of relate to fungi because, I've read some science out there, and I know you're not a microbiologist, but that we originate from fungi, a billion years ago. We split off. Have you read about that at all?
No, I haven't. No.
Okay.
But I believe what you're saying. Sounds reasonable.
Okay, so where I'm getting at is that the consciousness is essentially us fungi that are the highest form of fungi now. Because if you look at like our behaviors and what we do, it's really is we're almost parasitical of the earth. I've got to eat certain amount of food every day to live. I got to cut down certain things to build my house, and this has got to die for me to live today, and this has got to die to make my clothes, and all these different things. And it's almost as if I am the macro scale of the fungi, right? And I'm, they're in me, they're in my gut, they're everywhere. They're going to consume me when I die. It's as if we're fungi realizing who we are, and the goal is not to be a fungi, to not be a parasite. It's weird. So I don't know where I was getting with that. I guess I was just
I'll make a comment. It triggered something in me. There was this guy, Eric Neumann, wrote a book about the history of consciousness. He wrote this book in 1948, I think. Yeah. I'm not quoting the name of the book correctly. I read the book a while ago, and he talks about the development of our human consciousness through human life as a sort of a metaphorical replay of the development of consciousness through the history of life itself. If life itself has had these different stages, fungi, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and so on, and up to primates and man, that those stages that consciousness has gone through in the history of life itself, they sort of replay metaphorically in an individual life, the life of an individual organism from birth to death. Somehow I thought about that idea based on what you said.
Yeah, and it makes sense to where we're at now in this year 2019. If we go back 2,000 years, it was more of a tribal societies and cultures, and then it formed around ideas of how to live, right? Religion, and those were formulated into books, and these books became our laws, and these laws have become our system. And then here we are today, where we're each can individually, as like you today, Bernardo, where you could be free for the most part, think how you want to do, have a career, and not be persecuted, and kind of live your own path as you see fit in your own consciousness, your own little cell, right? And here we are on our cell phones and communicating through these devices, right? And then they say that human DNA or salmon DNA, they're making computer programs out of now. Our DNA can be programmed and changed. So it's fascinating times that we're in now. And Bernardo, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you have going on now? Anything you want to tell the audience?
I just have a new book out, The Idea of the World. I have to look at it, it's right next to me. It is my 7th book. And in this book, I've tried to make my case for the philosophy of idealism, analytic idealism, this idea that consciousness is fundamental. There is only one universal consciousness, and the challenge is to explain everything in terms of that one universal consciousness. I make a very analytic, very hard-nosed, rigorous academic case for that in this book. It is certainly readable, but it's the first book I wrote in which I make no concessions to accessibility. I try to make it as accessible as I can, but without compromising the argument itself. I thought it would be not a big seller compared to my other books, which were written to be very accessible. And I was very surprised that right now it has sold very well even before release. Sent my publishers scrambling for printing more. And I'm very surprised, very positively surprised. Made me feel like I was patronizing people before, that people can take a lot more than I thought. People who are not in the field, people who didn't study this, they can digest this. So that's the big thing right now. I've completed another PhD. I'm going to defend it in a few days from this moment that we are recording this. By the time your audience sees this, maybe it has already happened. And I'm doing that in order to give even more academic substantiation to the book. So this latest PhD thesis is a companion volume to the book. And I did it to show that not only is the book based on a number of papers published in academic journals, academia has even given me another PhD for this set of ideas. It is my attempt to come at this from a perspective, from an angle that people cannot dismiss on the basis of it being woo-woo or wishful thinking or flaky or new agey. They can't do that anymore. It is impossible. They have now to argue on the content. They have now to tell me exactly where I made a mistake and why. And then we can engage in a debate. That makes it a lot more difficult for the spokespeople of militant materialism and atheism to go after me, because usually it's drive-by shooting what they do. It's an easy job. Now it's not. They would really have to think and put some effort. And if they do, I would love to debate them.
Yeah, you add a lot of credibility, Bernardo. When I was researching you for this podcast, I delved into the scientific forums and the philosophical forums, and there seems to be a lot of debate and talk. So you seem to be building that bridge, and I think you use that term a lot in your writings, that your books and so forth, and the articles that I've read. And I think that's well needed out there. We do need a bridge, and someone like you that has a lot of credibility, that does come from the materialistic, scientific, militant side of science. And then now you're on the philosophical side, but you're bringing the science, as you said, the analytical, philosophical science to it that no one, well, they could debate it if they like, but it's facts, and that's what it's based on. So that's why I feel you're probably really popular, is you have a lot of people that come from that left side that I feel they always had some seeds in them of philosophical. Maybe they were questioning it, and they are private philosophers on the side, and they just keep that to the side, right? Because it's not popular to talk about that. And so when they see someone like you come out, I feel that it has other people come out. They model themselves after you. You become an idea that they could model themselves after. You know?
I've been thinking a lot about this since I saw what happened in the couple of months leading up to the release of the book. I mean, it was pre-sold so massively. It violated my own models of my audience and reality. How can this happen? I was thinking. And what I thought was the following. People intuitively, at an emotional level, at an intuitive level, using those other psychic functions that are just as valid as the rational ego, they already see that something is terribly wrong with our mainstream cultural narrative, mainstream physicalism, materialism, but they need intellectual permission to allow themselves to embrace what they already know at that intuitive emotional level. And maybe this book is what they need to give themselves this permission. They need to go through this book and say, look, this guy, he has turned every stone over. He did not leave any stone unturned. He has addressed every point of his story. He has addressed every possible objection to his story. And then they feel comfortable when they say, okay, now I can embrace what I already knew. This guy didn't tell me anything new. He just helped me accept what I already knew. I think this is what's happening, although I cannot know.
Yeah, I think you're right, definitely, Bernardo. And you need to do some more podcasts like this. I'm glad that you're being really active out there with your articles, and then also with these podcasts. You agreed to come on here. I think that people need to hear this type of stuff, the science of consciousness, what's going on. And where can they find your book and also your articles?
If they just Google my name, I think they'll find a lot. My website is sort of a central point. There are links to everything from my website, videos, free articles. There's my freely downloadable latest PhD thesis in there, links to the books, my forum. So if they go to bernardokastrup.com, Bernardo Kastrup, one word, and Kastrup with K, from there they can go anywhere. Great.
Thank you for being on The Gnostic Warrior. It was great talking to you today. I learned a lot. Maybe we could have you on in the next 6 months, and then good luck with the PhD in the next few days.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. It was a pleasure talking to you.
All right. You're welcome. Take care.